Welcome everyone to the SZ4D International Webinar Series. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. I'm Anaïs Ferraud. I'm the SZ4D Managing Director, and I'm be your host today. Before I introduce the speaker and we get started, I'd like to take a few seconds and share a few announcements. First, SZ4D is running a scientist matchmaking program to help individuals create new collaborations and share mentorship opportunities. If you are interested in joining the community of scientists from across the globe, I invite you to take the quick survey. The link will be added to the chat in a moment. I also invite you to browse our science platform on the SZ4D website, which promotes science across subduction zones. The platform includes a collection of science nuggets that highlight what the community has been up to. We also curate a reading list of the latest publications relevant to SZ4D science. And if you'd like to include your recent published paper to the list, please email me and I'll include that to the list. Applications to host an exchange participant will close on June 1st. If you are based in the US or Chile and you are interested in welcoming to your group a student or postdoc for a 1-month visit, please visit the link in the chat that I'll post it in a minute. And applications for participants will open at the end of the month, so stay tuned. Finally, the speaker for next month's webinar is Sean Gallen from Colorado State University. We'll send an announcement very soon with the link to register, and we hope that you can join us. And now, quick housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted later today on our YouTube channel, where you can find all of our past webinars. Live translated captions are available. If you want, you can select your preferred language by clicking on the closed captions button located at the bottom of your screen. And finally, feel free to use the Q&A feature. That's also available at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions to the speaker. We'll get to them at the end of the presentation. I'm very happy to introduce today's speaker. Sara, welcome. Very glad you're here. Sara Penniston-Dorland is a professor at the University of Maryland. Sara's research focuses on subduction zone processes with an emphasis on metamorphic exhumed rocks. She investigates subduction-related fluids with a particular emphasis on their sources, flow pathways, and mass transfer. Sara's toolkit includes fieldwork combined with mineralogical, geochemical, isotopic, and textural analysis. Today, she'll walk us through the timescales and episodicity of fluid flow along the subduction interface, and she will offer a petrological and geochemical perspective. Sara, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Anaïs, for that wonderful introduction. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great. And it looks like my floating bar is still there, so we'll just leave it. Oh, here we go, more. There we go, hide floating meeting controls. Okay, so I'm going to get started. I'm really excited to share with all of you the work that we've been doing in my research group. Investigating processes of fluid flow and specifically along the subduction interface, and specifically focusing on trying to understand timescales and episodicity of that fluid flow. And I am going to be talking about rocks exhumed from fossil subduction zones, so providing a petrological and geochemical perspective on those processes. And I'd like to acknowledge my funding source. NSF has funded this research, and also the collaborators whose names you can see on this slide. Okay, so this is probably preaching to the choir. There's a whole host of reasons why subduction fluid flow is important. When we think about hazards, subduction zone fluids are implicated in the generation of arc volcanoes. You see here the image from the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in 1991. And fluid release and transport within subduction zones is associated with a whole host of different types of seismicity. And you can see the image of the devastating tsunami associated with the Tohoku earthquake in 2011. When we think about subduction fluids, we can look at a schematic cross-section like the one that's shown here. We have an oceanic plate coming in from the left-hand side of the diagram, diving down beneath an overriding plate, either continental or oceanic. And as the rocks of the crust get deeper into beneath the overriding plate, they heat up, they experience increased pressures and temperatures and release fluids. And you can see that on this diagram illustrated by these various blue arrows. And when we think about the subduction interface, there are also a variety of different types of seismicity that occur along the interface. There are, of course, the extremely devastating megathrust earthquakes. I've highlighted those with a green circle on the cross-section. These occur up at depths up to about 25 kilometers deep. Both up dip and down dip of the region of the seismogenic zone where these megathrust earthquakes occur, there's a phenomenon that's referred to collectively as episodic tremor and slip that consists of both slow slip and non-volcanic tremor. I've highlighted those with red circles on the cross section. The durations of these episodic tremor and slip events are typically longer than megathrust earthquake events. They're on the order of days to weeks, but in some cases have been observed to range up to tens of years. And then finally, there are deeper seismicity along the subduction interface, 70 kilometers and deeper. So I've highlighted those in yellow on the cross section. I'll be focusing quite a bit on slow slip, and while it's not the most hazardous of activities, it does accommodate the slip budget of faults, and as such, it may impact hazards in many ways where there's a lot to be explored on this topic. It can reduce fault hazards, and it's thought that in the opposite direction, it might actually transfer stress to huge earthquakes. So it's really important for us to try to understand these slow slip processes. There's been a lot of research on active subduction zones, which have made connections between the subduction zone fluids and episodic tremor and slip in active subduction zones. And so I just show some examples here. There are some receiver function studies shown on the right. And on these diagrams, we see the regions in red that are labeled with this LVZ. These are low velocity zones. They occur right above this or at the top of the subducting slab. They also coincide with zones of high seismic reflectivity and electrical conductivity and have high Poisson's ratios. And all of these characteristics are consistent with high pore fluid pressures. These LVZ regions coincide with regions of non-volcanic tremor. You can see in the bottom here a figure from Delft and others in 2018. Again, this reddish color is the low velocity zone in the cross section. And you can see right above that, this red line showing the increase in the percent of tremor that's associated with this LVZ region. So there are clear connections in active subduction between fluids and episodic tremor and slip. What I'm going to talk about is what we can learn from rocks that are exhumed from the subduction interface about metamorphic fluids, about metamorphic fluid flow, and try to see if we can make connections to what these observations from active subduction zones. These exhumed metamorphic rocks are really our only source of material that comes directly from the deep subduction interface, and they do provide a record of fluid flow that we can interrogate to try to understand the processes of fluid flow. And just so we're on the same page, we are talking about rocks like eclogite and blue schist in this lovely photograph here, and also some garnet amphibolite rocks. You can see on the right-hand part of this slide, a pressure temperature diagram. It's a compilation of the peak metamorphic conditions for rocks exhumed from fossil subduction zones. So every diamond on this diagram represents a peak condition, metamorphic condition for an exhumed subduction zone. And you can see these are superimposed on regions with labels. These are our metamorphic facies, pressure and temperature conditions where different mineral assemblages are stable. And again, it's different varieties of eclogite, blue schist, and also some amphibolite. So these are the rocks that I'm going to be talking about today. And as mentioned, we are going to focus a little bit on what we can learn about timescales of fluid flow because our goal is ultimately to compare the timescales that we can find preserved in the rock record to timescales of the events, in particular of events like slow slip that occur in active subduction zones. So in today's talk, I'm going to talk about two different localities. One is a shallower locality. So I've highlighted here with this red circle. This is the Catalina Schist, and the depths that it records are consistent with depths of the lower or the down dip slow slip region, around 45-ish kilometers. And I'm also going to talk about a deeper locality, the Monviso Ophiolite, which is located in Italy. And you'll see why I'll make connections with that as well. So let's start with the Catalina Schist. This is a place that I have had the pleasure of doing fieldwork for about 15 years. This is a field photograph taken from the highest point of the island, looking towards the northwestern tip. The Catalina Schist is a suite of subduction-related metamorphic rocks that span a range of pressure temperature conditions. So it's a perfect natural laboratory to try to understand subduction processes. You can see on the left here a geologic map of the island. The island itself is located off the coast of Los Angeles, just an hour's ferry ride. Most of the southeastern part of the island are not subduction-related metamorphic rocks. They're younger volcanic rocks. But you can see all of these other different patterns in the northwestern part of the island are metamorphic rocks of the Catalina Schist. And there's a range of different metamorphic facies that correspond to different pressure temperature conditions. Those pressure temperature conditions are illustrated on the right. And so you can see LA lawsonite albite, LBS lawsonite blue schist, and so forth. I'm going to be focusing for most of my talk on the highest grade metamorphic rocks of the Catalina Schist, and these are amphibolite facies rocks. I've put a star on the map that shows the location of those amphibolite facies rocks. And on the right-hand PT diagram, you can see the pressure temperature estimates for these rocks. My former student, Kaylee Harvey, provided this estimate in her 2021 paper. Importantly, for thinking about connections to active processes like episodic tremor and slip, you can see the range of pressures that would be associated with depths for inactive subduction zones where episodic tremor and slip is recorded. And we can see there's an overlap between these rocks and the depths or the pressures at which ETS processes occur. So our hope is in studying these rocks that we can shed some light on fluid flow events that are related to ETS. Okay, so let's have a little bit of background in order to understand the results. I want to tell you a little bit about the rocks themselves. When we go to the Catalina Schist, we see, as in many subduction zones worldwide, there are two different types of rock exposures. One we refer to as coherent. This is a photograph of a coherent rock in the field. And by this, we mean that there's continuous lithologic layering. You can see the yellow lines on the outcrop designed to draw your eye to that. In some cases, this layering can be traced up to kilometer scales. And they do contain deformation structures like foliation, folding, and faulting. And you can see there's a lovely little backward C-shaped fold in the upper left-hand corner of this photo. Also found in melange zones, or sorry, in exhumed rocks worldwide are melange zones. And this is, melange is a French word for mixture. And that well describes these rocks. They're mixed up exposures of different lithologies. They have what we refer to as a block and matrix structure. So you can see that I've labeled block and matrix in these various photographs. The blocks are larger. The matrix tends to be finer grained material. It tends to be foliated and tends to wrap around the blocks. Maybe you can see that in this top middle picture where the matrix is kind of fingering its way over the block. Many of these blocks have what we refer to as reaction rinds. You can see that nicely illustrated in the bottom image. We call them rinds because sort of like a lemon rind or an orange rind, they wrap around the entire block. And they have different mineralogy and in some cases, different chemistry from the blocks themselves. And these reaction lines have been interpreted by geologists for quite some time as representing products of fluid flow. So our goal is to study these reaction lines to try to understand fluid flow processes. The melange zones themselves, this mixed up material are thought to represent the interface between the subducting slab and the overlying plate. They've been studied for decades. You can see them in this paper from Mark Kloos in 1982, where he talked about melange flow of materials within this interface. Also an illustration from Bachman and others in 2009. And our summary paper in 2016, trying to encapsulate what the features of melange are from different outcrops worldwide. And then finally, Nielsen and Marshall talking about melange diapirs and trying to connect that to arc magma generation. This location at the interface between the subducting slab and overlying plate really makes it the perfect place to study fluid rock interactions because as you'll see from this diagram here, these blue arrows, actually I have a zoom in of it on this next slide. The blue arrows represent fluid flow, and there's a lot of evidence that's been accumulated over study of these types of rocks that suggests that fluid flow is channelized through these melange zones. So what I hope to tell you today is what we can learn from melange about fluid flow at the subduction interface. As I mentioned, we studied features like these reaction lines, features that tell us about fluid flow. And one of the types of features that we can see that tells us about fluid flow are metamorphic veins. You can see an example of a metamorphic vein in this top right-hand image. These are locations where the rock has fractured, and the fracture opens and fluid enters the fracture. Minerals precipitate from the fluid. In this case, this is a garnet calcite vein. And sometimes those fluids also interact with the rock around the fracture. And you can see here that the rock has turned green, essentially due to chemical interaction with the fluid that is present inside of the vein. And so we study features like veins to try to understand information about that fluid. And then I also mentioned that we study features like the reaction lines in melange because there's also evidence there for fluid flow. And study of both of these types of features will help us understand what the rocks can tell us about fluid flow. So what do we know about fluids in the Catalina Schist? It's been studied for quite some time. In the late 80s and early 90s, Gray Bebout measured oxygen isotopic compositions of rocks of the Catalina Schist. And he interpreted the oxygen isotope evidence to indicate evidence for very large-scale fluid infiltration through the melange. And so what you can see on this graph is the delta O18 that tells us the ratio of the isotopes measured in the samples. There's 3 different metamorphic grades. Here's our amphibolite facies at the top. One thing to be aware of is that the amphibolite facies blocks that are found in the melange are mostly mafic rocks and ultramafic rocks. So the mafic rocks would have had a protolith such as basalt, and the ultramafic rocks would have had a protolith like peridotite or serpentinite. There are a few sedimentary rocks as well, but mostly mafic and ultramafic rocks, and I'll return to that concept in a minute. When we think about mafic and ultramafic rocks, though, these are rocks that are mantle-derived. Mantle-derived rocks have relatively low delta O18 values. So on this scale that is shown on the graph, they would be way over to the left. What you can see is that the measurements of ultramafic rocks, which are the black or the darkest filled in circles, and the mafic rocks, which are the ones with the diagonal stripes, that these have elevated delta O18 values compared to what their protolith would likely have been. And the more altered they are, the higher the delta O18, and they tend to cluster at this mean of 13 per mil. This was true for the amphibolite facies. It's also true for the green schist facies, blue schist facies. So this is found throughout the Catalina Schist, this high delta O18. And the interpretation is that the fluid that there's fluid that has interacted with these rocks that has a high delta O18. And this is a characteristic of metasedimentary rocks. You can see those are these open symbols with the little dashed lines inside of them. They have higher delta O18 fluid that devolatilized from these metasedimentary rocks would have this high delta O18 signature, could travel through the mafic and ultramafic parts of the melange and impart that signature. So this is the evidence for this large-scale fluid infiltration. Large scale, again, also because we see this evidence throughout all of the different metamorphic facies of the Catalina schist. And the reaction rinds are part of this, category of altered rocks. And so these reaction rinds have evidence as well for having interacted with fluids. And so they're a perfect opportunity for us to study them to try to understand fluids. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these reaction rinds. In order to understand the fluid history, we also need to understand some of the other processes that have acted in concert with fluid flow to create these reaction rinds. And one of the processes that we've learned over the years is that there's actually a mechanical mixing of materials at the interface between these blocks and the surrounding matrix. And so you can see here, we're sitting on a block. This is a relatively low grade block. This one's the a lawsonite blue schist facies block. And I'm sitting here at the bottom with my feet on the core of the block. Gray Bebout is up here on the left. He's sitting on the rind, a reaction rind for this block. My former student Julia is sitting up here on the reaction rind, and her head is also kind of overlapping with this dark material, which is the melange matrix. So we're going to zoom into this interface here in this red region. What you can see is that the edge of the block and the interface between the block and the surrounding matrix is very convoluted. And there's evidence for intermingling of material. We can see lighter colored block rind surrounded by matrix and darker colored matrix surrounded by rind. So we have this field evidence for mechanical mixing of materials at the interface. I'll show you another example. This is from one of the low-grade rocks as well. This is from the lawsonite albite facies. We had a rock drill that we brought out in the field with us, and we drilled across the contact. So in this photo, what you're looking at on the left is the lighter colored material is, again, the block reaction rind, and the darker colored material is the matrix. And what we can see from this drill core is that the rind is fragmenting, and it's got lots of little broken bits over here, and the matrix is kind of worming its way among those broken fragments of the block rind. And this fits well within a model where the blocks are forming these reaction rinds due to fluid flow. So the reaction rinds themselves have a lot of hydrous minerals. And so fluid rock interactions create those hydrous minerals. The hydrous minerals are weaker. And so then we have this disaggregation of material and this mixing, this actual mechanical mixing of matrix and reaction rind. And then this is followed by recrystallization. As the block and its rind and matrix get deeper in the subduction zone, they experience higher temperatures. And we have a recrystallization, and we have a new chemistry that's created by this mixing. Over time, the matrix, the composition of the matrix also forms from this kind of mixing of materials. And also over time, the blocks would be consumed, right? We're eating away, they're breaking parts off of the edge. I've got just a little schematic diagram that's meant to sort of illustrate this process. We have fluid flow here indicated by the white squiggly arrows that's weakening the outer parts of the blocks. Pieces of the blocks break off and mix with the surrounding matrix. We've got some garnets growing. We'll talk about garnets a little bit later in this talk. More breaking and mixing and continued fluid flow and mechanical mixing, which over time destroys the blocks and creates the matrix. So I've shown you field evidence for this process. There's also a lot of chemical evidence to support this process of mechanical mixing. I show here some work by Gray Bebout in the early 2000s. When we think about elements, we think about fluid mobile elements, and we think about fluid immobile elements. And so these, the evidence for this mechanical mixing focuses on fluid immobile elements, elements that tend not to dissolve in fluids and be moved around that way. So we have here a graph that shows aluminum versus magnesium. Mafic rocks are relatively high in aluminum, but lower in magnesium compared to ultramafic rocks, which are very high in magnesium and low in aluminum. So the ultramafic rocks are the black triangles, and the mafic rocks are the black circles. Keep in mind that the amphibolite facies is mostly these two rock types. And what we can see is that the matrix compositions, which are the open squares, and also the reaction rind compositions, which are the open circles and open triangles, fall on a mixing array between the mafic end members and the ultramafic end members. So this further documents this process of mechanical mixing of materials that creates the reaction rinds and also the matrix. And we see evidence for this in other relatively immobile elements like chromium and nickel and titanium and zirconium as well. Okay, so this provides a bit of a backdrop. We'll be returning to these concepts of mechanical mixing when we're trying to understand the fluids. But let's go ahead now and dive into what we can learn about fluids by studying these features. We will use a relatively fluid mobile element. In this case, our group has spent a lot of time using the element lithium because it does partition into fluids and moves around, can be transported by fluids. It can give us information about those fluids. It is a rapidly diffusing element, and that is what gives us the key into determining timescales. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a little bit. It has two stable isotopes, lithium-6 and lithium-7. The two isotopes have different diffusivities. So lithium-6 actually diffuses faster than lithium-7. And what that means is that if lithium diffuses, just that process of diffusion alone changes the isotope ratio because 6 diffuses faster than 7. When we measure the isotope ratio, we use this standard delta notation. You see it at the top of the slide, delta 7 lithium. And here we're looking at the ratio of lithium-7 to lithium-6 of our sample compared to this standard LSVEC. The isotopic fractionation, the changing of the ratio during diffusion, was demonstrated really nicely by Frank Richter and others in 2003. And they took a basalt powder and a rhyolite powder and put them adjacent to each other in an experimental capsule. They raised that capsule to pressures of 1.2 gigapascals and temperatures of 1,350 degrees C. At those temperatures, both the basalt and the rhyolite are melted. The basalt and rhyolite had different starting lithium concentrations. So concentrations you can see on the left-hand axis, the basalt around 800 ppm, the rhyolite less than 100 ppm. The circles show the lithium concentrations. They also had different isotopic compositions. And here we look at the right-hand axis to see delta 7 lithium in per mil units. The basalt had higher delta 7 lithium, somewhere around 40 per mil. And the rhyolite had about 20 per mil delta 7 lithium. They let this experiment run for a grand total of 6 minutes. It's super short. And then they analyzed a profile between the basalt and rhyolite, and those results are shown as the open symbols. The circles, you can see the lithium diffused quite nicely from the lithium-rich basalt to the lithium pore rhyolite. We see this lovely gradational pattern in lithium concentration that's consistent with diffusion. The isotope ratio also changed as lithium diffused from left to right. I mentioned that lithium-6 diffuses faster than lithium-7. So that means that on the front of the diffusion profile, there's more 6, and so the ratio actually gets lower. So the delta 7 lithium decreases at the front of this diffusion profile. And you create isotopic ratios that didn't exist in either of the starting materials. And so this type of feature is indicative of, it's a signature of diffusion. When we see this in lithium isotopes, we know that this is indicative of a diffusion process. You can see here, it's decreased this value of delta 7 lithium up to 20 per mil. And we'll be talking about these types of patterns. We refer to this sometimes as a trough or a negative excursion. And when we see these negative excursions or these troughs in the rock record, they can tell us about diffusion. And the process of diffusion is time dependent. So if this experiment had been allowed to run for longer than 6 minutes, say 10 minutes, you would see a diffusion profile that would have expanded over a longer distance. And so we can measure lithium isotopes, we can measure the distances over which we see variations, and we can extract timescales from those types of measurements. And this has been done in the past. So we studied a sample that you can see here in the bottom middle of the slide. This is an eclogite blue schist pair. It's not very large. You see a centimeter scale bar here. This is actually from the Franciscan complex, which is further north in California. But this is a previous study that we published in 2010. And in this sample, this is an eclogite on the left and a blue schist on the right. The eclogite has garnet. You can see the sort of orange spots in the left-hand side of the image, and it has amphicite pyroxene that makes the green color. The right-hand side, you can see it has a blue color that's associated with the sodic amphibole. Hopefully, maybe you can see there's also these sort of greenish patches. I'll circle this one. When we look at those patches close up, we can see, this is a backscattered electron image using an electron probe. We can see that these are consist of the mineral chlorite. But the chlorite has a shape that's not its natural shape. It's taking on the shape that is associated with garnets. We call this a pseudomorph, a false shape. And it tells us that this patch of chlorite would originally have been a garnet. Garnet is a mineral that does not contain water in its mineral structure. Chlorite has water in its mineral structure. So these types of replacement textures, in the absence of veins or other features, can tell us that fluid has interacted with this rock. We also see the sodic amphibole and other hydrous mineral, sodic amphibole, which is a hydrous mineral, so it has water in its structure, and other minerals like pumpellyite, which also has water in its structure. We see those on the right-hand side replacing amphicite pyroxene. So our interpretation of this sample is that the blue schist side of the sample experienced fluid flow and was originally an eclogite, like the left-hand side of the rock, but has been altered to this blue schist. The model here is that fluid is actually traveling within the rock porosity, so around the edges of the grains, and it's altering and creating these new minerals within the rock. When we look at the lithium isotope profile, we slice this up into little rock slices and crushed it and analyze it for bulk rock lithium isotopes. You can see the traverse across the top that shows the results. The results are consistent with that interpretation of flow through this blue schist layer, in that we have a relatively uniform delta-7 lithium within that blue schist layer. So the fluid that's traveling through it would interact with the rock and impart its isotopic signature to the newly crystallized minerals. And it's uniform because the fluid we interpret in this case is traveling parallel to the contact between the eclogite and blue schist. We can see, however, in the eclogite part of the sample, this lovely little gradational change in delta-7 lithium. We can model this using models of one-dimensional diffusion, and we can extract information about the timescales. Remember, this is a very short, very small distance, only a half a centimeter or so, and we get a timescale of about 100 years extracted from that type of model. This approach has also been taken studying a vein. So you can see on the right a paper by Tim Yohn and others in 2012, where they studied a vein, the same idea. The blue dots here show the lithium isotopic compositions moving away from the vein, and the different colored lines show different timescales that they interpreted for that fluid rock interaction. 200 years was their interpretation. So the model here, just so you understand, is that lithium is actually diffusing through the intergranular fluid, so through the fluid along the boundaries, and then it's incorporated in the minerals when they crystallize. These timescales are interpreted to represent the duration of the fluid's pulses that have created the features. And we can see here that these are, when we think about geologic timescales, relatively short fluid pulse durations. There have been a couple of studies subsequent to these, which have estimated even shorter timescales. So we've got really short timescales of fluid movement, tens days to hundreds of years for these very small centimeter scale features. Maybe these short timescales are related to seismicity and movement along the subduction interface. We don't know. We also don't know whether these timescales represent just a single pulse of fluid traveling through the rock, or perhaps fluid revisiting pathways. This has been documented in some localities. So it might represent the time integration of multiple fluid flow events. So we don't know that either. But what we're interested in is trying to understand the duration of fluid flow along the subduction interface. And so here we're talking about these melange zones, and this would potentially be larger scale flow. And our hypothesis is that because we have a potentially kilometer scale melange channel, that we might have longer time scales within these rocks of the melange zone. So that's where we're going to go, is to try to understand the duration of fluid transport at the subduction interface by studying these reaction rinds. So my former student, Will Hoover, has been working on these samples, and there are two different amphibolite facies, blocks, and associated reaction rinds, like the one that's illustrated here. That's actually the top one, and measured transects across the reaction rinds into the blocks. You can see the results for the two different samples, top and bottom. Left-hand results are the isotope ratios. The right are the lithium concentrations. We can see in both cases that we have a lovely isotopic trough or a negative excursion found in the isotope ratios. So this was really exciting for us. We see this evidence for diffusion of lithium. And so Will has created a bulk lithium model where he's actually using a Monte Carlo approach. So he's put constraints on upper and lower bounds of characteristics like diffusion coefficients. We have to estimate porosity and a number of other characteristics that go into the diffusion equation. And then he's used a Monte Carlo approach where he's done 1 million different iterations and picked the top 1% in terms of the best fit to the data. And so you can see those fits illustrated here in the blue and green colors. And so you can see that you can successfully model the isotope profiles that are observed in these samples through this type of approach. The timescales that he has extracted from these models are remarkably short. They are tens of years, about 40 years in both cases of fluid transport within the melange matrix. There's a lot of details, pinned and unpinned boundaries, which I'm happy to talk about if anybody has questions. And you can see there is some uncertainty, of course, on these estimates. Remarkable, however, that we have relatively similar results from both of these blocks. These are float blocks, but they were not near each other. So we're interpreting this to represent a pervasive, regionally pervasive fluid transport that is on the order of 40 years. So we need to think about what kind of conceptual model, how can we understand this fluid flow and what can it tell us about fluid flow at this subduction interface? The duration that we see from these subduction interface rocks is not any longer than those centimeter scale features that I showed you on that previous slide. We can see it's this green square here, and it falls in the same range of fluid flow durations as the other estimates. And also, when we think about melange development, 40 years is much, much less than the melange zone would have had time to develop. If we consider from surface down to 50 kilometers, that path would likely take millions to tens of millions of years. So 40 years is like the blink of an eye. So why is this? We think that the main reason that this is so short is we can appeal back to that mechanical aspect of rind formation that I described towards the beginning of the talk. Diffusion profiles will develop with fluid flow events, but those rinds and blocks are being destroyed progressively as the rocks go deeper and deeper into the subduction zone. So we think that this is why we don't see a full history of flow that these blocks may have experienced, because they're essentially destroying themselves as they progressively move down into the subduction zone. We see other evidence that helps us develop this conceptual model. In the reaction rinds themselves, we see veins, quartz and garnet veins. They're not big, but you can see one of them shown in this photomicrograph. It's this lighter colored feature. That's the quartz cutting across the middle of this image. The garnet are these sort of brownish colored spots in there. The garnet presence tells us that these fractures occurred at peak metamorphic conditions. And because they are veins, they tell us that fracturing is part of this process that, is responsible for these fluid rock interactions. So we can take all of this evidence together, and it is most consistent with models that are of fluid pressure cycling. These are sometimes referred to as fault valve models. Simpson proposed these in 1992. The idea is that you have cycles in which fluid pressure first builds up. So pore fluid pressure can build up over here on the left of this sequence. And then we can have slow slip and fracture development. And when those fractures develop, fluid escapes. When the fluid escapes and travels along the porosity that's created here, the pore pressure drops. We have fluid flow. We can have development of those reaction rinds. We can have those diffusion profiles forming. Eventually, then mineral precipitation clogs up and heals that permeability. And then the cycle kind of starts all over again. So it's a repetitive cycle. Our question then is that 40 years, is it the permeability lifetime of just a single cycle, or does it represent the integration of a lot of different cycles of seismicity and healing? And we can't tell this from these bulk measurements because they integrate everything that the rock has experienced over time. So it brings us to the question, and the second location will help us answer that, and that is, how can we determine how episodic fluid flow is? So I'm going to take you to the other location. This is deeper rocks of the Monviso Ophiolite. These are rocks located in the Western Alps. You see a map of the Alps with the Monviso location shown in a red rectangle. This is also a high-grade block in a shear zone. We see we're at much higher pressures here. These are the intermediate depth earthquake and probably around 70-kilometer conditions that are recorded. We see on the right here a cross-section of the Monviso Ophiolite. The block in the shear zone I'll be talking about is indicated by this yellow star. You see it's located within this lower shear zone. And here we're going to move away from our bulk rock measurements and talk about in situ measurements of lithium isotopes that we make within the mineral garnet. And these will tell us about episodicity of fluid transport. And we can think about garnet the way we think about rings, tree rings, right? So a tree, its early part of its history is recorded in the rings in the center, and it continuously grows new rings throughout its history towards the present at the edge. Garnets do similarly. They record a history from center to edge, and they tend to grow over protracted periods during the history of a rock. So they're really useful for trying to understand events. We can look at single rings, if you will, or we call them growth zones, and try to tease out part of a rock's history from them. And the method that we're using here is secondary ion mass spectrometry, or SIMS, where we have an ion beam ablating away at our garnet. You can see a nice reflected light image of a garnet here with each of the little SIMS spots on it. Here is the SIMS that we use for these analyses. It's located in Lausanne. Sample goes in at one end, it's sputtered here, and then the ions travel along the long flight path and are collected over here. Okay, so the sample itself, you can see here's a field photograph. It is an eclogite block. It has a reaction rind as well. That's this darker green material that's at the top of the block. We can look at a thin section photo, which is shown over on the right. The block is at the top part. So this consists again of the classic eclogite minerals, garnet and amphicite pyroxene. The reaction zone is at the bottom. So we've got a thin section that just cuts across this reaction interface. That also contains garnet. You can see the little sort of light brown patches in here, and the mineral chlorite. Remember, that's our hydrous mineral, tells us about fluid rock interactions. That's the light green material. So we're going to zoom into a slice of this thin section. You can see here within this slice that there are a number of garnets that have been analyzed. And this is, again, work that my former student, Will Hoover, has done and published in 2022. And we'll talk a little bit about what we can find from garnets from different parts along this traverse from block to reaction rind. So let's start within the block itself. We can see here a garnet shown. This is a manganese X-ray map. Manganese is compatible within garnets. So we typically see these bullseye patterns with high manganese when the garnet starts to grow. And then the manganese drops off because it's all kind of gone into the center and we don't have much manganese left in the rock. So this has a nice high manganese center. We also see a feature here, this light purple line. This is an annulus of enrichment in manganese. And we can see it has faces that represent the growth zones of the garnet, the shape of the garnet in its past. So this is a growth feature. We also see that feature when we look at the calcium X-ray map. Every dot on this X-ray map shows the location of a lithium isotope analysis, and we can project those on a graph from rim to rim, which is shown over here on the right, showing the delta 7 lithium measurements. We see that we have 2 of these isotopic troughs or negative excursions that are indicated by the red arrows. And each of these low delta 7 lithium measurements is indicated as a red dot on the map. We see that each of these low delta 7 lithium measurements are just outside of this manganese calcium annulus. So the interpretation here is that these low delta 7 lithium values are a growth feature. They're happening because while the garnet, or they're incorporated into the garnet while the garnet is growing. When we look at the corners of these annuli, we see that they are actually thicker at the corners. You can see that really nicely in the manganese map over here on the right. These have been observed in other garnets in the past, and they've been interpreted to represent rapid disequilibrium growth. This has also been created experimentally. People have grown olivines from melt, and when they grow them really fast, they form these thick corners that are kind of skeletal olivine features. So we see then that this annulus is likely a feature that formed rapidly due to disequilibrium growth. We can now move to the outer reaction zone and look at the garnets there. These are actually several different garnets. You can see they're high manganese cores. Again, every dot on here represents a lithium isotope measurement. What is unique and interesting about this one is we see there's actually 2 negative values that are separated by a high value in between. So this is a double excursion or trough, if you will. Will did a lot of sort of garnet stratigraphy and correlated isotope compositions and major element zoning amongst garnets throughout this region, and he counted up to 4 different negative excursions. So we've got multiple troughs. In these garnets, these are out in our reaction zone, we see that these low delta 7 lithium values are found in regions where we have what we call oscillatory zoning, right? So we have variations in the major element chemistry. Those oscillations are shown in the X-ray maps over on the right, and they're indicated by the dashed white lines. Oscillatory zoning is also commonly associated with disequilibrium rapid growth. So again, we have this association of low delta 7 lithium with features indicative of rapid growth. So the interpretation of these features is shown here. You can see on the left, there's a GIF that represents our interpretation. Here we have the shear zone on the left and the reaction zone and the block on the right. And if we start off this purple line, you see it evolve over time. It's the isotope ratio. Starts off with a uniform delta 7 lithium. As lithium diffuses from the shear zone into the block, and again, our model is that it's diffusing through an intergranular fluid, we see that an isotopic trough develops and migrates inwards into the block itself. The garnet, which is shown here as the red diamond, is growing during this time. Remember, we have this evidence for rapid disequilibrium growth, likely being enhanced by the presence of fluids. And the garnet itself overgrows and incorporates that trough as it passes by. And we can see that in this inset graph. You can see the actual delta 7 lithium that the garnet itself would be recording. So it's acting as a passive marker while the diffusion front passes by. The fact that we have multiple troughs suggests that there are multiple instances of diffusion, and therefore multiple instances of fluid flow. In this case, the fluid flow is interpreted to be happening within the shear zone. So we've got episodicity of fluid flow here being recorded within these troughs in the garnets. Now, I've talked about 2 different localities, right? Our future goal is to combine these 2 types of measurements together, the bulk rock measurements with the in situ measurements. And indeed, we have an ongoing project with postdoc Alex Cisneros, where we're investigating samples from a variety of localities. You can see here some preliminary results from an eclogite in New Caledonia. You can see he's peppering the heck out of these garnets. And you can see there's a lot of variability in the lithium isotope ratios. So stay tuned for the results of that work. So I'll just finish with this conclusion slide. I've shown you that we can determine evidence for duration of fluid infiltration by measuring these bulk rock lithium diffusion profiles and these reaction rinds. We got relatively short time scales, shorter than what we expected for large scale flow. These are in the same order of magnitude as ETS, so maybe we're approaching some information that may be telling us about ETS, we don't know. We can also learn about episodicity by doing these lithium isotope measurements within garnet, and we can see that in some localities, multiple episodes are recorded. And moving forward, we need to combine these measurements of total duration and number of episodes to try to come up with average durations of individual fluid flow events. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And thanks everyone for being here. Yes, we can give a round of applause for our speaker. And I do love the word mélange.
I thought you might appreciate that.
I do, I do. Everyone, I invite you to ask your questions to Sarah using the Q&A feature or just using the chat. And we'll be monitoring if anyone has any question. Well, it looks like your presentation was crystal clear. Everybody got everything.
No, I love this field area, the Catalina Schist. If you ever have the opportunity to go to Santa Catalina Island, anyone, it's right off the coast of Los Angeles. You can catch a ferry from Long Beach Island, or sorry, not Long Beach Island, Long Beach ferry station. It's just an hour ride, and you can see all kinds of fabulous rocks.
And we do have, so I was lucky to visit Catalina Island for the first time with Sarah a few years ago during our GeoPrisms time, and I went back last fall.
Great.
Fabulous. We start to have a few questions. Look at that. Starting with Jason, who just says, "Hello, Sarah. That was an awesome talk."
And Jason.
Yeah, always feel good to hear that. Thanks, Jason, for being here. Gareth, hi, Gareth. We also we go way back. Great talk. How did you constrain the temperature for the diffusion modeling, given that these rocks experienced a large range of temperatures? Also, what stops the diffusion clock? In volcanic rocks, it would be eruption.
Right. So these are really good questions. They're things that we have to think about for sure. And with exhumed rocks, you know, there's an extensive history that they've recorded, both prograde and retrograde. The presence of the garnets in those metamorphic veins that I showed in the reaction rind suggests that it's the peak metamorphic temperature, which has been constrained by zirconium and rutile measurements to be about 650 to 700 degrees. I will also say that the diffusivity of lithium, while temperature dependent, we don't really know it very well. So I mentioned that Will, in his modeling, put a range of diffusivity values and is looking for the best fit in that case. So there's of course uncertainty in all of those things. So that's the answer to the question about temperature conditions. And then the other part of the question had to do with what stops the clock. So the interpretation of what stops the clock in this case is the cessation of fluid flow. So the absence of the fluid, which is the medium through which lithium travels. We have the crystallization of minerals that happens along with that, and that incorporates the lithium isotopic signal and perhaps also sort of clogs the pathways for diffusion. That's, you know, that's my idea or mental model for it anyway.
Thanks, and thanks, Gareth, for the question. We have John Hooker. Thanks, John, for the question. Great talk. How many maximum flow events have been recorded in a garnet?
How many maximum flow events have been recorded in a garnet? That's a good question. I know people have speculated about or have found evidence for fluid flow, in particular oxygen isotopes have been a past indicator that's been used for fluid flow events. I'll have to look up, see if anybody's found more than 4. I don't really know.
All right. We have Jason has a question. The utility of lithium isotopes at the reaction rinds is awesome. Would you expect any type of measurable lithium signal within coherent blue schist eclogite units if the fluid were local?
Yeah. If it's local, you know, what drives diffusion is a concentration gradient, right? So you would need to have I would expect that it would be more likely with an externally derived fluid that has a different lithium concentration than the rock itself experiences. So less likely for an internally derived fluid. Certainly possible at lower grades. We didn't find, we actually looked at some of the lower grade reaction rinds and did not find good diffusion profiles. It may be that you know, it was a fluid that actually was still in equilibrium with the rock, so hard to know in that case. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay.
Thumbs up, nice. I love how these little icons are appearing at the bottom of the screen.
Anyone wants to throw a heart or clapping hands, everyone, maybe. Well, if there is no more questions, let's give those 4 minutes back to everyone. I would like to thank Sara again for your time and just being here. That was wonderful of you to take your time to come and join us. Thank you all for joining as well. A reminder that these recordings will be posted on our YouTube channel, and you can watch Sara's presentation anytime you want. And we will announce soon our next speaker for June, Sean Gallen. So stay tuned if you'd like to join us. Again, thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Sara.
Thank you, Anais. Thanks for the invitation.
Of
Bye, everyone.
course. Bye, everyone.